Welcome to Spiritual Foundations for Life. This is day number 186. The background for Paul's teaching on marriage and sexuality was his belief that the present form of the world was passing away and that the second coming of Christ was near and that life would be stressful. Paul's counsel is amazingly relevant for this contemporary world in which we live, whether we're single or engaged, married to a believer, married to an unbeliever, or in a difficult marriage, or divorced, or widowed. Paul's main concern, no matter what our matrimonial state, was to reinforce our devotion to the Lord, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 35. To that end, Paul uses single people, Paul urges single people never to put their desire for marriage higher than their desire for God, their desire to serve God, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 26, and to view their singleness as a gift, and yes, perhaps a lifelong calling from the Lord, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 7. Paul realizes that Christians are going to be attracted to people of the opposite sex and tempted into immorality, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. And so he places boundaries on available partners and on behavior, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 34. First thing he says is that believers should not marry unbelievers, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 to 16, because the righteous really have nothing in common with the unrighteous. They would be unequally yoked, he refers to it as, with different values, different standards, and a different direction in life. And that's why you can't walk together. Second, for the sake of Christian ministry, it is good for a person not to marry. However, because there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. Those already married are not to withhold themselves from each other sexually. Their bodies not only belong to themselves, but they also belong to each other for mutual sexual fulfillment. However, no spouse can satisfy the other spouse's lust. That can only be resolved through their relationship with God, where God sets them free of unnatural sexual urges. Neither spouse has the right to violate the other person's conscience or defile him or her physically in any way, because that person's body is the temple of God, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19. Sexual intimacy and fulfillment in marriage can only happen in the context of mutually shared love and trust. Paul advises Christian couples not to separate, but if they do, to remain unmarried and work towards reconciliation. There are times when a relationship can be strained. That separation may be necessary for the good of the family. But ideally, the couple should stay together and work out their issues. But if there is too much tension, separate for a while, work through issues, and come back together. However, if one spouse becomes physically or mentally abusive, it may be advisable to separate, but not divorce yet, unless there are scriptural grounds for such action. The Bible teaches that wives and children should be submissive, but it also teaches that governing authorities have the right to punish wrongdoers, according to Romans chapter 13, verse 4. So those in authority have the responsibility to protect and to provide, even in the marriage relationship. And in case of abuse, the state has the right to intervene, protect battered wives and abused children, and prosecute all offenders. Biblically, there are only two grounds for divorce and remarriage. The first is abandonment by an unbelieving spouse. Hear me, the unbelieving spouse may leave. Should the couple be unequally yoked together, the believer must stay committed to the marriage for the purpose of his or her spouse's salvation. The unbeliever can leave, and if he does, or he or she does, then the believer is not bound to the marriage, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15. The second biblical grounds for divorce is adultery, and some would argue sexual perversion. Under the law, the adulterer would have to be stoned to death. So obviously, the remaining spouse would be free to marry. Now, we don't do that today, but that's stressing how serious this issue is. Under grace, forgiveness and reconciliation should always be attempted, but if not successful, the faithful spouse has the right to divorce and remarry. Our key point today is that our relationship with God takes precedence over all matters of marriage. And our key verse, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. God bless you. See you tomorrow for another episode of Spiritual Foundations for Life.